All right, so I'm here with Jennifer Logan. I've had an opportunity to actually know you for a couple of years, but I hear that you are doing some pretty awesome things. Are you able to talk us through exactly what you are doing right now?
For sure. Okay, so starting in 2018, the summer of 2018, I began a research project interviewing, there's a list, retired former Seventh-Day Adventist Church workers living in Scotland. I have to count them off when I tell people. Interviewing, retired church workers about their experiences of working for the church, generally how it shaped them as people, how they think they've shaped the church, retiring, having kids, growing up in church or coming to faith, basically a lot about their own personal journeys, but one that has taken place usually on quite a public stage. So that included pastors, and spoke to pastors' wives as well, because they play as much of a role. Secretaries, teachers, mission presidents, conference presidents, all sorts of like administrative roles, as well as some of the more practical ones like teaching and pastoring and things like that. And that began July 2018, ran for a year in collaboration with the church. They helped fund it, which was amazing. Pastor Paul Tompkins was kind of my acting supervisor and my go-to.
Did you find it quite easy, in a sense, to find funding for the project, especially coming from the church as well?
It was actually, this project was originally an idea of Pastor Marcel, who's now at Newbold, who kind of saw me as an unemployed anthropologist and these people as a rapidly aging, interesting group, and we're like, okay, do something about this. And so he told me about the idea in the beginning of 2018, and then I had to think about it, came up with a proposal and took it to the church, and Paul was immediately on board. He was the pastor of Crete Church at the time, which is my home church, and he was great in helping me figure out who to talk to next about getting funding, and different parties gave as much as they could. The local church were incredible. The Scottish mission were really on board, especially because it was interviewing people who had worked in the Scottish mission. That was a big criteria in order to not get like sucked into studying Newbold forever and ever and ever. So that was like quite a good cut-off.
Come home,
exactly. Stay in and around Scotland. And he was fantastic. The TED were on board, and the BUC also helped, and different areas supplied different funding, which was great and meant that I could do this project part-time for a year. Which was amazing.
That's awesome. So what exactly led you to doing this specific project on retired pastors? Something the rest in Scotland.
Niche. It's niche. I love telling people it's niche. Honestly, it was Marcel who basically said, especially in Crete Church, the number of these older retired church workers, pastors and others, who are there is extraordinary. They have all there's good golf, the nice views, their families are there for various reasons, which actually came up a lot in the discussions, have all moved to Crete and that area. I interviewed some who were in Dundee. I went down to Nottingham to interview some people who, so it was kind of trying to catch people who had spent time working in the Scottish mission, so that I could ask them about their impact in that space as well. But that's mainly how I found them. And personally, I really like asking people to tell me their stories. I find storytelling a really interesting, something really incredible happens when you ask people to tell you their story.
You kind of have this connection with the person as well, kind of knowing their past, their present,
completely,
possibly their future
exactly
as well.
And there's this lovely realization that came quite early on, that so I moved to Crete Church when I was my family moved up from London, and we moved to Crete when I was 4, and so many of the people who I interviewed in Crete Church have always been around and have seen me grow up, and it was really interesting to sit down and say, okay, I've only been around for 20 years, what have you been doing? What this happened to you? That's crazy. And to ask about what happened before I showed up, and how did they find it? What did you think when that happened to you? Were you okay? How did you recover? What shaped you? What was your favorite thing about this part of your life? And yeah, it was a lovely way to get to know people on a different level
than kind of seeing them at church and saying hi, bye.
Yeah.
You know, I hope your week was great.
Completely.
You know, kind of thing. You know, it's just like quite passing, in a sense, passing comments that you can have on people's lives, but rather actually kind of sitting down and getting to understand someone on a much more deeper level.
Definitely. No, there's this really wonderful author called, her name is, I think, Anne Devere Smith. She started interviewing random people that she found on the street at first. I don't remember where, somewhere in the States, maybe New York or LA. She made this interview project, started interviewing people, eventually became a very good interviewer and worked her way up to interviewing, I think at the time, Clinton. But she has this quote in her book, which is, I think, called Talk to Me or something, about what happens when you ask people to tell you about them. Like direct questions. I'm looking at you, full attention. Please tell me about yourself. And what happens when we step away from that kind of everyday conversation? Can you pick the kids up from school? Like, who actually are you in this moment? Where do you want to go next? Where have you been? What are you thinking about right now? And she uses the term unrehearsed language. So you move into this unrehearsed territory. You step off the script.
There's no
and suddenly there's this kind of drop where people are like, oh, you're really asking me that? Okay, you're really asking me what I think about dying. Okay, off we go. And it's kind of this sometimes mental abyss. You haven't really thought about it before. And you're dropped into talking to this kid, this 24-year-old who's sitting opposite you, and you're 60-something, and they're asking you to tell them what you think about dying and about your partner and 50 years of marriage. And it was incredible what people came up with. But the whole process of talking and sharing stories and coming together as different generations from a kind of shared religious cultural background, enough in common to talk, a shared language and things, but enough different that I need you to explain yourself to me. And what happens when people do that was just mind-bending.
It's quite crazy in our society now as well. You can look at it in a way that a lot of like the younger generation doesn't really connect with the older generation. You kind of feel that gap in the church, especially because you can almost feel the air is quite thick between the young and the old, and obviously these sort of like untold stories that are in between the two, and a sense of like misunderstanding or miscommunication between the two. And I think when you sit down and get a chance to communicate to someone behind the normal, like outside the normal conversation, outside the usual, I hope you go home okay yesterday, how was school, outside all that, and actually getting to understand somebody mentally and understanding their experiences a lot more kind of puts the pieces together, because that way you bring in like the old and the new, not to put it that way,
but definitely really
kind of bringing them together and understanding each other more. And I think in the church that is really needed, because considering the young are coming in, we have different ideas, we were quite quirky, and
I feel like the generational difference is really like it's really big. Definitely. And I think the word that you used at the beginning there was untold, and you're right, the air is thick with untold stories, and actually sitting someone down and saying, okay, you have these opinions, I actually want to hear them, can often take people off guard. I think in church settings, it is like a family often, and families are amazing, but often things go unsaid or resentments build up, and it's like, actually we're going to make a space designated for talking. This is what we're going to do here. And it was really interesting as the interviewer to sit down and say, okay, I'm not going to give you my opinion back. So for the first couple of interviews, people would be like, okay, so what do you think? And I was like, I don't get to tell you. I'm purely a blank canvas. Exactly. But that really kind of active listening. And one of the things that surprised me, these people are kind of the Adventist heroes. Some of them are like, one of them has an award for the Queen for like 8 work. One of them
for who?
from the Queen, no less. And
that's pretty cool.
No, it's crazy.
Seriously.
And another one, they've all devoted their lives to this thing. Incredible stories of faith and of what they've done and where they've been and how they've felt about it. And a lot of them are very public and they share like grand things that have happened. And to hear and sit down with people who have led countries through Adventism, and to ask them, you know, how did it feel when you lost your child? How did it feel when, you know, these really human, I'm probably going to cry, heads up at some point. It always happens.
Okay,
I get really on fire.
I'm sure we have some tissues.
But to ask them what they're afraid of, and to make a space to be human in this, especially for pastors, I found, in that role of leadership all the time. Who are you at the end of the day when you go home and collapse on the sofa? What rubbish TV do you love? Tell me about the ways in that you're really human, as well as these big spiritual leaders. This project was fundamentally a way of asking people, in this conversation that you're having with God, who are you? Talk to me about yourself.
And like, where do you stand as well?
Exactly.
In a sense.
And it's, as a church, the purpose is to talk about God and understand God better. But we're missing out on half of the conversation if we don't look at who's doing the talking. And it's really interesting to ask people who have given their whole lives to this in a very kind of, not to say that people who don't work in church service are not doing their own work, but literally for the church body, for this family, you are working for this. Who are you? And what do you think this is that you're doing?
It's quite interesting that you say that, because as a church, we depend so much on our pastors, and we look at pastors as though they are the shepherds. You know, we are the sheep, and they have to, like, in a sense, like, show us the way, show us where to go, what to do. But then we forget that they are also sheep as well.
Completely.
And we are not as understanding with their situations, especially when it comes to our own opinions and things we want to do, especially in a church setting, and putting them in a position that sort of like questions their own identity as well, because almost pastors are not allowed to be annoyed, angry, to cry, to show like human emotions that anybody else would, because as a shepherd, you have to be, you know, this sort of like strong, dominant kind of being, especially in a church setting. So a lot of those emotions you may not really see from pastors, and when they are kind of harsh and tough on the congregations, we have to do this, we have to do that, people are not necessarily always understanding. So based on the stories that you heard from the pastors, how do you think they dealt with situations where almost, you know, they were being questioned by their congregation, and this is the people that they, in a sense, they are leading, the people they should have a connection with at the end of the day, the people that kind of thriving to better socially, mentally, physically, and economically, in any sort of way? And how do you think they sort of like deal with situations like that? Because as young people talking, soon enough, one of us could become a pastor one day, one time, and understanding those situations and how to deal with them is quite difficult. So listening to these stories, how do you think they sort of like feel at the end of the day when they go back home and close the doors and have to deal with all that?
Okay, two main responses. I'll start with the slightly more. Often they get it wrong, and that can be a really hard thing to do and to admit to yourself. And sometimes, for many of them, they talk about how important it was not to admit to themselves that they were wrong for a long time. A real reckoning comes when you sit down and you think about the way that you behaved in a situation, when you lost it with that person. I had one participant talk about an excommunication that he had to do, and how it didn't sit with him at the time. But your job is to represent the will of the church, and it doesn't matter what you think, you have to. And he has wrestled with that.
Vote.
He has wrestled with that, and he at the time had a problem. And I know that telling that story for him, I imagine there were many sleepless nights over dealing with that situation at the time, and making his peace with it since. And he said that he has since seen the person that he had to do that to, and he described her as, oh, she still pays her tithe. Like, to have such courage in the face of what happened to her, to still want to be part of this community after how she was treated for various reasons. And I think that in his telling of that story, I think he revealed how much that cost him to do, and how much a burden was lifted when she told him that she was okay. It's like, I understand. This is not in your control.
Yeah, it's almost like being a judge, but you
completely,
you
but you do not agree with the ruling.
And then you know people dislike you, but you're just kind of passing on a message. You're kind of doing
completely. You have to.
What is supposed to be done.
In some ways, you are doing what you're told. And so he would describe, he describes years of feeling very uncomfortable about a message that he was preaching. But you go around to old ladies' houses, and they're the people who give half of their money in tithe, and they're living in poverty, and they're paying your wage, and you don't get to have a say. It's not. There's this really interesting balance of like, I feel convicted towards something, and I need to act what I believe is true, but also I've signed up with this corporate truth, and somewhere in the middle is this relationship, this negotiation of like, what am I going to do that I think is me, and me working for God, but also the church is working for God. And so there was a lot of disillusionment. There's a lot of the calling. I remember asking, so one of the questions I would ask is, when you got the call to being a pastor, what was that like? One guy laughed and said, it was a telephone call. It's a human. It's a group of people sitting in a room making some decisions. And that's not to say that they're not God inspired, but economics play a huge part. Where can we afford to put who, and do they have a family, and how many mouths are we feeding here? And all of these very human negotiations that have to happen. And I think there was a tension between what you feel was acting for the church, and the church is the voice of God, and what you feel your personal relationship with God, and trying to have space for that as well when you are managing everybody else's personal relationships with God.
Like, how do you manage
where do you have time for your own? And for with God and with your family. And many spoke about how they wish they had more time with their kids. I think of the pastors that I interviewed, most of their children weren't in church anymore, and many of them struggled with that. And
it's quite crazy that you do say that, the fact that a lot of the pastors' kids end up having to suffer for that lack of close communion between their parent, their pastoring parent.
And most have tried very hard not to ever make it seem like there is a decision between the two, but you work mad hours, and you're constantly available to people, and you're everybody's person in a time of crisis, and it is relentless. And it's interesting talking to the pastors' wives. They speak about how when we got married, we had no idea how this was going to be. It was so intense, but it's a team effort. We move where my husband needs to move. We drop, and most of them are quite fortunate.
Whether you like it or not, you have.
Yeah, you go, and most of them are very fortunate, and they spoke with a lot of gratitude about where they were able to stay for so long, and the kids got to go to high school all in one place, and primary school all in one place, and for most of them, the church had treated them quite well. And everybody, even those who were quite disillusioned with the idea of like a corporate person as advocate for God, there's so much in there. But even those were there's a lot of love for the church. And so the second part of the response, I guess, would be you are managing people's personal relationships with God, and people are taking it out on you, and there will be people who you just don't get on with, and you must. But these people do it because they love people. And one of them spoke about how he was a pastor and went through an enormous personal tragedy, and then became an elder and realized that, I just was never cut out to be a pastor. Like, I love greeting people on the door. That's what I love to do. I don't want to go through this particular book of the Bible with you and have to do this and have to tick off these boxes. And I got so much more freedom to connect with people as an elder, and I really enjoyed that. So I became an elder instead, and now I meet people on the door, and I meet Susan upstairs, and we go for coffee once a week, and I've been able to build those personal connections, whereas before I did not have the time as much, it's contractual, or
because you think as a pastor you have so much time to do so, because that is basically your job. But in
your
reality,
visits are scheduled, and you have like a certain amount of time.
I can't have 10 minutes with you. Sorry, what was your problem again?
Completely.
Oh, sorry, you're the wrong person. I'm supposed to be somewhere else right now.
It's incredible that they do anything like thinking about my own life, the ability to function that highly and have everything together so much. It takes an enormous personal toll. But I think it is there's a type of person who thrives in that environment. But frequently they also have support networks in the form of these incredible women who hi honey, I'm really sorry, but I'm coming home soon with 12 delegates from this conference and I need some food. And she's like, all right, I gotta do it. These women move heaven and earth to provide for everyone, and also are such a key part of the ministry as well. Many of them spoke about how, especially with any, I mean, it's a generational gap again, but with any problems relating to women, someone is having issues with getting pregnant, someone feels, there's an issue of domestic abuse, a couple are fighting. Women talk historically differently, more openly than men, but away from men as well. And so as the pastor, one of them spoke about how, like, he would arrive at a church, hear that there'd been a problem, but his wife had already sorted it out. She'd got the two women to talk again, or someone, so-and-so was happy and everyone was fine.
It's almost having a personal assistant.
Yeah, it's like he would never know, because it was an emotional issue, it was a social issue. And so often that was the pastor's wives who would take on that role. So you have this kind of power duo who are also somehow bringing up kids and all this.
At the same time.
And you love this work, but I think pastoral burnout is a really big deal and a major issue, and finding the space to have your own crises of faith, and what do you do when the pastor has doubts, this kind of, where do you go to be alone and to be in your own head and think about your own needs. And I think we put pastors particularly on a pedestal and expect them to not be human sometimes, and I think this project did a big service to showing, they're human. They're a bit crummy. Even the one who won awards from the Queen, like, has some interesting ideas that we're not all on board with, and and it's like, but this doesn't stop this passion that these people have for people and for God. And it's like, in the face of that, what else? You can't not do this work, so you must. Okay, amazing.
It's almost like trying to take away the humanity in them. So with this project exactly, so. What is going to happen? Is the book coming out? Are we going to be able to read about it?
Yes.
What's going to happen with the project in the next couple months, years?
Yes. So I foolishly planned for it to be a very short project. I thought a year would suffice, and then ended up having 18 astonishing, incredible, in-depth interview sessions. Usually there'd be like 4 or 6 sessions per person as well. Hundreds and hundreds of words were spoken, and sifting through all of it and trying to pick out patterns and things is what is currently happening at the moment. I am writing a collection of articles in the hope that kind of essays, so I come from an academic background, and trying to make them more readable for a start, figure out what's interesting to people and to who, and I'm kind of still in the development phase, but writing has started and is ongoing, and is wonderful to finally be sharing. I've been very fortunate to be able to do some lectures, so I gave one at Newbold a little while ago, which was amazing. really it's so good to be able to talk to other human beings about it. For a while these people were all living in my head, and it's nice to be like, this thing is real and outside
you kind of
me.
put it out there for other people. So do you feel like later on in the future maybe you would do a similar project for young people in the
Someone
church?
did ask. I would love to. I think that, so anthropology, which is what I'm trained in, it has this idea of participant observation is the kind of field work. You want to be involved enough that you understand what's going on, but far enough away that you have some critical distance. And I think my critical distance came in that these people were so much older than me. Explain yourself to me means, I really truly don't know what you mean when you talk about this. I wasn't, that you're literally calling the country by a name I don't know. And I'm not sure I would have that same distance with young people. So maybe when I'm 60. But honestly, I would love to. And I would have to find some other way of finding that distance. But I would love to try. For the moment, I'm trying to get my head down and get this out of my system. But hopefully at some point we will have a collection of articles and the transcripts available to be read somewhere, because these people are really worth hanging out with a little bit,
in the books.
In the books.
So of all the stories that of all the people that you interviewed, which one was most inspiring for you?
Okay, can I play with the question a little bit?
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
So a lot of this was collecting stories, but a lot of it was also collecting ways of approaching problems. A lifetime worth of patterns and habits, and some of them annoying, and very human. And some of the questions that I asked were designed to figure out both your life events, like give me a little bit of a biography about yourself. Who are you? Where were you born? Fill me in. But also, how do you feel about that? Do you think you would have felt about that differently if you were 20? How were you when you were 20? What's it been like bringing up children? And then get into like some of the more difficult ones, like have you suffered any losses? What have been your biggest failures? What is your biggest success? How do you measure a life well lived? And it's not even so much like do you measure it? It's how. Tell me how you work, as well as what you do. I want to know how you do it.
Yeah.
And so in terms of inspiring stories, so many. But what
was the one that stood out?
The one I did 3 interviews 3 days in a row, which I almost never did. Usually there was a week in between meeting people because it's quite an intense process. But I met one couple for 3 days in a row, and it was about 2 to 3 hours per session. And usually my brain, with that level of listening, is mince after 40 minutes. But it was hanging on. And this couple, again, it's a how related thing. Their lives are extraordinary, and I can tell you a couple of stories about how incredible they were. But the thing that had me crying buckets on the train, pouring things out into these notebooks that I've written hundreds of, and was just so overwhelmed by, was the love that they have for each other and the love that they have for the work that they do. And that came out in, he is the gentleman who won an award from the Queen. He's lived an extraordinary life of aid work and activism. As a pastor, as various different heads of departments for publishing companies and all sorts. And his wife was a teacher at Stanford School, the head teacher for a very long time. And together they really were on fire. And then, and still are in a different way. But then 8 years ago, possibly 9 years ago now, since I interviewed him, he suffered a stroke and was paralyzed from the neck down with, I think, movement in his left hand. I don't recall. It's in a notebook somewhere. And this person who played so many sports, was very outgoing, very busy in church, and flying around the world, going to all these places, organizing charity events, and just really on fire for ADRA, particularly. He was the head of the ADRA department for a long time. For him to now live his life in this shape and to make his peace with that is I think probably an ongoing process, but one that to me completely embodied grace. So forgiving of what had happened to him, and so considerate of his wife, who now is his carer, and the role that she does, and how they really practically organize that. So once a year she goes on holiday, and she gets a couple of days off, and someone else will take care of him for a bit. But she loves him, and she loves what he does and what he brings, and enables him to do so, and vice versa, and he does the same. And it was lovely to interview with him. She would be telling me about her childhood or something. He would be sitting there and he'd be like, "Oh, she was incredible at sport. She did this. She was amazing." She's not telling you, and they would boast for each other. And that was wonderful. And she'd blush and the love that they had for each other. And this space, because I'm there, I'm the necessary other for you to talk at. The space for them to say to each other as well, like, I so appreciate, you are extraordinary. You have been what I learned my pastoring skills for, the person I learned them from.
They kind of give each other.
And they were extraordinary. He has gone through, so he had all these slides, these photographs on slides that he would go through and drop them into the projector, but he couldn't do them with both of his hands, so he would do it with his teeth. And he's gone through 2,000 slides and more of pictures of his family and copying them onto a computer and making PowerPoint presentations for every member of his family of like memories that they have together. He now lives a much smaller geographical life, but is such a big character, and his wife is exactly the same. And to sit and be in their presence for a period of time was just a really intense.
Your perspective on life as well. In a sense.
It was the most intense experience, condensed into such a short period of time as well. It just knocked me for six. And those two were inspiring on a level I haven't come across in a long time. But everyone sitting and being humble and telling me about the things that they're afraid of and the things that they love and why they love it. The characters, the stories were inspiring, but how these people conducted themselves and the fervence that they had, even as retired people, to look after people and to try to work for God and try to figure out what it is that we're all doing here was, it just blew me away. It was,
because even after they retire, you can't just shake off something you've been doing for,
exactly.
For like
and that comes with its own different kind of identity crisis, but also like it's finding ways to take those skills that you developed over a lifetime of, you know, maybe you're a secretary. How can I use my skills as administrator, as secretary, as someone who's really good with numbers and figures, to carry on working for the church or for God in a way that is now more appropriate for my body and my position. And so many have gone on to lead small church charities or to work on voluntary basis on the church board, and these people are still so active in the spaces that they can now take part in. And half of the battle of stepping over that identity crisis is figuring out new ways to repurpose your skills. And
sort of like recycle.
Yeah, completely. And it's like,
I was good at this. I need
exactly.
To
so I really enjoyed this when I was a pastor, and I wasn't able to do it so much. So I'm now going to do this, or I developed this skill. Grand, that's what I will bring to the table. And it's something that was lovely to ask questions about, because so many of them had articulated it before. They knew they'd have to speak to their spouses or their families or to themselves. You know, what am I good at? What am I going to do with my day? And so asking them about it, many of them are quite comfortable and to present, this is what I do now, this is who I am now, this is where I think I'm going. Some of them found it a lot more difficult. I don't know what I'm doing. Who am I if I'm not the pastor? One of them I spoke to, really interestingly, didn't want to be called pastor. He said, I'm retired now. I'm not pastor so-and-so. I'm just so-and-so. You can call me Uncle so-and-so, but I'm... that was a really interesting distinction. Like, the role is done, and trying to figure out who I'm going to be after the role is now taking place. But that is a role reserved for people who are doing that work in this way, and I'm not doing that anymore.
So now this is
now I go about figuring out what I'm doing next completely.
That's amazing. Honestly, I can't wait to read about all these beautiful stories about these beautiful people that you have talked about. And is there a way on how we can get hands on these beautiful stories?
I'm currently in the process of writing a collection of articles, which at some point will be out in the world. I'm hoping that they can be accessible to everyone. I would both in a practical finding them way, but also in a reading way. I'm writing for people who are religious, not religious. If you don't know what a mission president is, that's grand. I'll put it in the index, it'll be okay. So writing on a couple of different themes, like particularly one on pastors, one on retiring, one on death, one on family, one on community, one on aging, a bunch of different things. And I'm trying to get the first ones out and public, but I also don't know what the last one's going to be or when it will be. So this might be a 20-year process, which I'm just like constantly bashing on about these pastors that no one can remember, maybe. So those will be happening at some point. The other thing is a collection of the transcripts that will hopefully be going into the Adventist archives. I've still to figure out how to make sure that they're watertight in their anonymity. Even the stories I've been telling you makes that individual really identifiable. How many other people have done that role and been affected in this way. So I'm still working on how to tighten that up. But the plan is to have a copy of these transcripts available so that anyone can have a read and come to your own conclusions and not just have to listen to me talk about it all the time.
That's amazing. Honestly, thank you so much. And I'll be looking forward, and hopefully like other people are looking forward to reading these transcripts and as well as these beautiful stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you.